Often, churches that experience the departure of a pastor are not aware of a valuable resource that's available to them. What we are talking about is a specialized transitional minister, or STM for short. Now, it's not uncommon during a pastoral vacancy for churches to have an interim minister who provides a wonderful ministry of stability and continuity while a church is searching for their next pastor. These pinch hitters are often beloved and do an important and good ministry among God's people. An STM, however, does more than just fill in. STMs help a congregation look at itself, sometimes for the very first time. With a congregation's leadership, they look at the ministry and the structure and the unique dynamics that are in play for a particular congregation. An STM is particularly valuable if the previous pastorate was either long or short. Often when there are unvoiced and unrecognized dynamics in a congregation, an STM can be invaluable. So this training time is about familiarizing you and your team with the benefits of an STM, and we want to encourage you to talk about whether or not those benefits fit your need. Storehouse Resourcing. We are about encouraging you, equipping you, and empowering you for all of the conversations that you need to be having. So a specialized transitional minister is a specially appointed person in the life of a congregation who helps them during their time between pastors. That transition can be marked by uncertainty, change, grief, fear, hopefulness, and all kinds of anxiety. Some congregations say this is a position that we need to have as we look at ourselves and as we look to the future. My colleague and friend, Reverend Art Van Walde, joins me today. Art has a passion for STMs and the work and the ministry that they do because he believes in the renewing power that can happen in times of uncertainty, transition, and crisis. So my question for you to start things off today is, if my church is without a pastor and we are in a period where we are in transition, how do we know if an STM is for us?
Mark, I think there's several reasons that will dictate if a church needs an STM. I think the first one is a church has had a very long-term pastorate, 12, 15, or more years. The church has been served well by that pastor, but there are certain patterns that have been established. So the church needs to address that. So if they've had a long-term pastorate, good idea to get an STM.
It's probably difficult for a congregation to sometimes not identify with that previous pastor and then figure out who they are without that pastor. I'm guessing that's why one is needed in a long-term pastorate.
Yeah, it begins to help them address what the next pastorate will look like apart from the previous pastor. The second reason would be is a series of short-term pastorates. For the past 25 years, there hasn't been a pastor that has stayed at the church for 4 or 5 or more years. Why is that? What's going on in the congregational DNA that is making short-term pastorates the norm? The third one is this, a congregational tragedy. A pastor suddenly dies, and the congregation is cast into grief and despair. A good STM comes into that situation and begins to bring healing in a congregational tragedy. Fourth, impropriety of the last pastor. Sometimes pastors can do really dumb things, and that can bring a lot of mistrust into a congregation. And because of that impropriety, an STM is needed to help address what has transpired, help deal with the pain and the hurt so the church can move forward. And the final reason to get an STM would be rapidly changing ministry context. There's a new ethnicity that has moved into the neighborhood, or there's a social dynamic going on, an economic dynamic in that region. an STM can begin to address what is transpiring and how ministry is going to look different in the new environment, because it can't be like it was in the past.
And I suspect for those who are watching this, there are some congregations that face multiple dynamics all at once, which would probably be all the more reason why they should consider having an STM.
That is correct, Mark. Yes.
And these incidents in the life of a congregation are easy, I think, for congregants to minimize and say this is just part of life. And yet I hear you having some real emotional sensitivity to what all of these changes, these transitions may mean in a community of faith. And STM can help with that.
Yes. We're pros at minimalizing. We love to do that as people and as congregations. STMs don't minimalize the past. They help a congregation look into her past, look into her DNA, and begin to ask questions. Okay, how are we going to move forward in a new era of health?
So in a nutshell, how do they do that? What are some of the behaviors? What does an STM do that is unique for a congregation's need in that season of their life?
Well, the first thing that they do, Mark, is they listen. Good STMs listen, listen, listen. They listen to the people. They listen to the narrative. They listen to the history. They listen to the people. Active listening. That's what an STM does.
So if I'm listening to you, what I'm hearing is a congregation will oftentimes have a narrative in play that they may or may not know about, and it may be something that they are not giving voice to. I hear you saying an STM listens for that narrative and listens if the congregation is not aware of how that's playing. Is that the case?
Yeah, an STM has their ear low to the ground, and they're listening in such a way that they're noticing what isn't being said. Many times what isn't being said also demonstrates what has transpired in the past. So an STM listens to what's being said, what's not being said, and begins to help the congregation hear its narrative, what's going on.
I can't imagine a more important role in the transition for someone who's trained for that. So number 2 on your list is loving God's people. Now, from my chair, I think, well, it's every pastor's job to love their people, but I suspect that in the interim, in between pastorates, that there's a special role for an STM to love God's people, especially in light of their story, their narrative. Can you say more about loving God's people?
Yes. STMs love their congregations well. Many times they're coming into situations where there's a lot of brokenness, there's hurt, there can be despair, there's also heightened levels of anxiety. And the way you begin helping congregations work through that is you love them. You let them know that they matter, that they are cared for. So you love them well.
And I suspect, especially if some of their hurts and their issues were with a previous pastor, and I'm not faulting him or her at all, but sometimes the wounds have been imposed by a pastor. Sometimes they've triggered old wounds in the life of God's people. But if some of those wounds are connected with the previous pastor, that's healing that may not be able to happen with him or her, that an STM might be able to address. Is that what you're saying?
Yes. An STM pastor, he can really help in the healing process by loving the people well, helping the congregation understand not all pastors operate in the same way as your previous pastor did. Not all pastors will do what your previous pastor had done. And they love them, and they begin to help them to understand that there can be a new way of life, a new way of ministry, a new way of going forward. And that's done through loving them and helping them see a new life.
So number 3 on your list of good and important practices of an STM is intercessory prayer. Why is that important?
STM pastors need to pray, and they need to pray often for their congregation because change comes through the power of the Holy Spirit. So they are modeling for the congregation that they are persons of prayer. They are modeling to the congregation that they are listening to the Holy Spirit and listening to the Holy Spirit's leading and guiding for the future. And they model that well for the church because change comes through the power of the Spirit.
So number 4 on your list is regular communication. Those of us who work in the church ordinarily know that communication is very important, but I have to believe that in a period of transition when a congregation has multiple questions flowing in the room, that for an STM, regular communication is very important. Can you speak to that a little bit?
Yes, a real estate agent, their adage is this: location, location, location. STMs practice communication, communication, communication. Many times in a broken system, there's under-communication. And when there's under-communication, there are false narratives, false stories that are told. And they can have a life of their own. An STM pastor, through their listening, begins to communicate with the congregation what they are hearing from the people, from the Holy Spirit, and they communicate, over-communicate. They help them understand and hear what is going on.
And I suspect they create, when there's been a vacuum of communication, they create new patterns. I recently heard of a local church that was in transition, and their leadership made the decision that every other week or every third week, they would communicate with the congregation in the church's mailboxes. They dedicated a set color for their communication so that when the congregation saw in their mailbox a particular color, it triggered an awareness that, oh, we're receiving a communication, and I suspect that grows trust. Is that what an STM does?
Yes, an STM communicates in many different forms. It can be on Sundays giving an update, what's going on. It can be through emails. It can be through personal contacts. If the STM is computer savvy, they can do a Vimeo and send that out weekly to the congregation of what's transpiring. It's communication.
So number 5 on your list is coaching for a sense of team. Now, I can't go into a bookstore anywhere or online without seeing the word coaching used. So how do you mean it when you're talking about an STM?
Many times a congregation has unhealthy patterns. They tend to do what has been done in the past, and they opt for those patterns. STMs come into a congregation and they begin coaching the leadership, saying, let's think about new ways of doing things. Let's ask questions about why this happened in the past, what's going on today, how we can move forward. They begin coaching in a different and new dynamic for that congregation. And I look at coaching this way. I look at it as being a player coach. The STM is with the leadership, and he's saying to them, we're doing this together. We're building this team together. We're moving forward as a unit. And that is done through healthy coaching.
So when you use it that way, I think of sometimes pastors, and especially former pastors, can be experienced as very directive, as sort of calling the shots. And whether or not that's the case, that's sometimes how a congregation experiences him or her. Mm-hmm. But what I hear you, when you use the word coaching, I almost hear like a therapist who's asking questions and doing so in a non-judgmental way. Or I hear a midwife who is helping the one who's in labor do the hard work, but encouraging and supporting. Is that the kind of work that an STM does?
Yes. Sometimes pastors love to tell congregations and people what to do. STMs, they love to ask this question: what do you think? It's such an empowering question to ask. Or, if you were in this situation, what would you do? That's coaching for a team. It's asking the leadership, how would you deal with this? How can we do this together?
It almost creates a new culture in the life of a congregation when they've had a narrative with another pastor. I can see that being empowering for a congregation. Maybe scary, but also empowering. So number 6 on your list is adaptive learning. We know in education over the last 20 years that those who care about education talk about creating schools and organizations and institutions with a capacity to learn. And it seems to me that what you're advocating for is that churches pick up on some of this as well. Can you speak to adaptive learning?
Churches love to rely on past methods. And many times those past methods worked well 30 years ago, but they're not going to work well today. STM ministry begins to ask the question, okay, how can we celebrate what you did back then, but how can we ask questions? How can we learn and grow and move forward today? They begin to create a culture of learning, and that learning is healthy and it's good.
Well, oftentimes in families and in churches, questions aren't always encouraged. And I hear you saying this is one of the chief operations of an STM, to encourage the asking of questions and looking within a congregation to find some of the answers. I can't think of a better way to do one's calling.
Encouraging good questions is a wonderful work of an STM.
So number 7 on your list is that STMs can provide an enhanced sense of focus. Can you speak to that?
Yeah, an STM begins to dig in with the congregation and ask questions such as, why were you formed? What is your mission? What is your vision? What drove you in the past? And begins to ask the questions in such a way, okay, what happened in the past, how is it going to move you forward in the future? It can address questions if the church came out of something that was a schism. You can work with that. If it came out of a certain music style and that music style has changed, how it can move forward in a new way. But yeah, an STM asks questions about core values, vision, mission, why the church is there, and helps them use that as they move forward.
I could see that being so helpful in my own community and in the communities that we serve. We both have congregations that are known as First Church, Second Church, Third Church, Fourth Church, each of which have their own unique birth order that I suspect congregations don't think of in terms of their narrative. Some churches were born out of mission and vision, some are born out of separation, and I suspect some of those stories continue to play in ways congregations aren't even aware of.
Many times they're not even asking those questions of why we came into being. What they're doing is so rooted within them that they're just doing it without thinking about it. And STM asks the question with them, why are you doing that? Why did you come into being? Why is this practice there? And they help the congregation address that.
So I hear your excitement and your enthusiasm, and our viewers are probably not in that spot because they are in that valley. They are in between pastors. They are wondering, processing what has happened and what may happen. But I hear you speaking about this transition as being a unique opportunity to grow. And whether or not that's because of crisis or because of change, isn't it the case that so often we want to just plow through and ignore those things that are an important part of our life? How does the STM really get at that?
The STM with the congregation says this is a time for us to grow and to learn and to move forward. The time between pastorates is not the time to put the car, so to speak, in neutral. It's to keep the car in drive, maybe slow it down a little bit, but keep moving forward, asking good, healthy questions about the future and saying, you know what, there is a preferred future out there.
So awareness, reflection, self-analysis, I hear that. So how does a church find one or find a good one?
Well, if the church is part of a denomination, contact the denominational services and ask if there is a list of STMs that they can contact. If that denomination doesn't have a list of STMs, maybe contact a sister denomination and ask, okay, do you have a list of STMs? If the church isn't part of a denomination, what they can do is they can ask, okay, what denominations might be similar to us? And contact that denomination to see if there is a list of STMs that they can contact.
So here's a question that every leadership team is going to be asking. How much does this cost? Is this more expensive than a ordinary pastor who serves with us for years? What is the financial pain level on a position like this?
Well, Mark, this isn't time for the church to bargain hunt, to search for an STM on a bargain rack. STM pastors come with a toolkit. Many times they have specific training in family systems theory, and they have sought other avenues of training for their ministry.
They sound like ministerial Jedi.
Yes. So a congregation needs to realize that they need to pay an STM a salary that is similar to their previous pastor. And if that denomination or if that congregation has continuing education and pension and all those items, they need to think about paying those items. So yes, this is not time to bargain hunt.
So there's a key difference between an interim minister and a specialized transitional minister. And we want to give you these 7 practices, these 7 benefits that come with an STM for you and your leadership team to be thinking about. Does this intersect with where our needs are right now? Just recognize there is a difference. Interim pastors serve an important function in the life of a congregation and can pinch hit well, but an STM can help you delve deeper into some of the questions of your own story, your own calling, and your own future calling for the life of your community of faith and the wider community around you. Storehouse Resourcing is about encouraging you, equipping you, and empowering you to have the conversations that you need to be having.